In the frozen wilderness of 1867 Wyoming Territory, a battle-scarred hermit discovers two desperate souls bleeding in the snow. A pregnant woman and her terrified daughter fleeing a past that's finally caught up with them. When territorial lawmen arrive with accusations and threats to tear this fragile new family apart, Ezra McKinnon must choose between the safety of solitude and a love worth fighting for. But what price will he pay to protect the sanctuary he never knew he needed? Blood drops in fresh snow told a story that made Ezra McKinnon's stomach twist into knots. The crimson spots led straight to his cabin door, like a trail of breadcrumbs in a dark fairy tale. He gripped his hunting rifle tighter, boots crunching through the Wyoming Territory's latest snowfall as he followed the mysterious path back toward his home. The winter of 1867 had been the coldest anyone could remember. Ice hung from pine branches like crystal daggers, and the wind cut through even the thickest coat like it was made of paper. Most folks had headed to warmer places months ago, but not Ezra. These mountains were his hiding place, his fortress against a world that had chewed him up and spit him out 10 years ago. At 42, Ezra looked like the mountains themselves, rough, weathered, and carved by too many storms. His beard had gone gray at the edges, and his hands bore scars from steel traps and sharp rocks. The Civil War had stolen his youth, his faith, and his ability to trust other people. Out here, the only sounds were wind through trees and his own breathing. That's how he liked it. But today was different. Today, someone had disturbed his peace. The blood drops grew bigger as they got closer to his cabin. Ezra's heart started beating faster. In 10 years of living alone, nobody had ever found his hideout. The nearest town was Laramie. 3 days' hard ride through mountain passes that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. Most people thought this area was haunted by Indian spirits or wild animals too dangerous to face. Ezra had built his cabin in a natural pocket between two granite walls, hidden from view unless you knew exactly where to look. Tall pine trees formed a protective circle around the small clearing, and a creek provided fresh water year-round. He'd chosen this spot because it felt like nature's own secret room, invisible to the outside world. The cabin itself was simple, but solid. Thick log walls, chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney that drew smoke straight up without spreading it around, and windows small enough to keep heat in, but big enough to watch for trouble. Inside, everything had its place. His rifle over the fireplace, dried meat hanging from the rafters, and shelves lined with supplies that could last him through any storm. But something was wrong with this picture. Smoke was rising from his chimney, which meant someone had been inside his home, touching his things, using his fireplace. Ezra's jaw tightened. After the war, he'd sworn never to let anyone get close enough to hurt him again. People meant complications, and complications meant pain. He moved closer to the cabin, using the trees for cover, like he'd learned during his soldier days. The blood trail led right to his front door, which hung slightly open. Through the crack, he could see the orange glow of his fireplace and hear something that made his blood run cold. The sound of crying. Not the rough sobs of a grown man, but the high, scared whimpers of a child in trouble. Ezra's finger found his rifle's trigger as he crept closer. Maybe this was a trap. Maybe outlaws had hurt someone and were using the crying to lure him into an ambush. He'd heard stories of bandits who used tricks like this to catch lonely mountain men off guard. But as he got nearer to the door, he could hear more than just crying. There was whispering, too. A woman's voice, soft and desperate, trying to comfort the child. And underneath it all, he heard something that made his stomach drop. The quick, shallow breathing of someone in serious pain. Ezra pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle, ready for anything. What he saw inside made him lower his weapon immediately. A woman sat slumped in his chair by the fireplace, her face pale as winter moonlight. She was clearly with child, her belly round under a torn and dirty dress. Blood stained her clothes and had dripped onto his wooden floor. Beside her, a little girl with dark braids pressed close to her mother's side, both of them shivering despite the fire's warmth. The woman's eyes met his, brown eyes full of fear and desperation, and something else he recognized from his own mirror. She'd been running from something terrible, just like he had been for the past 10 years. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the crackling fire. "Don't send us away. There's nowhere else to go." The little girl looked up at him with eyes too old for her young face. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but she watched him like she was ready to fight if he tried to hurt her mother. Her small hands were red with cold, and her lips had a blue tinge that meant she'd been outside too long in the freezing weather. Ezra stood in his doorway, caught between his old life and something he couldn't quite name yet. These two strangers had invaded his sanctuary, brought their troubles into his carefully ordered world. Every instinct told him to send them away before they could complicate his life. But something about the woman's eyes stopped him. They held the same haunted look he'd carried since the war, the look of someone who'd seen too much pain and was barely holding on. And the child. She reminded him of his sister's daughter, the one he'd never gotten to meet because he'd been too broken to go home after the fighting ended. The woman tried to stand up, probably to show respect, or maybe to run if he ordered them out. But the moment she put weight on her feet, she swayed and grabbed the chair for support. A small gasp of pain escaped her lips, and more blood appeared on her dress. "Ma'am, you need to sit back down," Ezra said, his voice rusty from not talking to people for so long. "You're hurt bad." "We won't stay long," she promised, sinking back into the chair. "Just until the storm passes. Just until." She didn't finish the sentence, but Ezra could guess. Just until whatever was chasing them gave up and went away. Just until she was strong enough to keep running. Just until the baby came, which looked like it might be soon. The little girl spoke for the first time, her voice clear and brave, despite her chattering teeth. "My mama helped people in town, but they got mean when the baby started coming. They said we had to leave." Ezra felt something twist in his chest. He'd seen how towns could turn against people who were different or inconvenient. During the war, he'd watched good people do terrible things just because they were scared or angry or wanted someone to blame for their problem. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow swirling past the glass. The storm was getting worse, which meant even if he wanted to send them away, they wouldn't survive the trip down the mountain. Like it or not, these strangers were stuck here until the weather cleared. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what all three of them needed, even if they didn't know it yet. 3 days of howling wind and sideways snow trapped them all together in Ezra's small cabin like animals in a cave. The woman had told him her name was Margaret Chen, and her daughter was called Lily. Both names felt strange on his tongue after years of talking only to himself and the mountains. Margaret's condition had gotten worse during the first night, and Ezra found himself doing things he'd never expected. He boiled water, tore up his cleanest shirts for bandages, and tried to remember what the army doctors had taught him about treating wounds. Her bleeding had slowed, but she still looked fragile as spun glass. The hardest part wasn't the nursing, it was the conversation. Lily asked questions constantly, her young mind hungry for knowledge despite their dangerous situation. She wanted to know about everything: why he lived alone, how he caught his food, what all the tools hanging on his walls were for, and whether he'd ever seen any bears up close. "Most bears are more scared of you than you are of them," Ezra explained, as he showed her how to bank the fire for the night. "But you still got to respect them. They're just trying to survive, same as anybody else." Margaret watched from her chair, wrapped in his warmest blanket. Her color had improved a little, and she'd managed to eat some of the rabbit stew he'd made, but Ezra could tell she was still holding secrets, still watching the door like she expected trouble to walk through it any moment. On the second day, while Lily napped by the fire, Margaret finally started talking about why they'd run. "I worked at the mission in Cheyenne," she said quietly, her hands folded over her belly. "My husband died in a mining accident before Lily was born, and the mission folks took us in. I helped teach children to read, tended the sick, kept the books balanced." Ezra nodded, cleaning his rifle while he listened. He'd learned that keeping his hands busy made conversation easier somehow. Things were good for a long time, Margaret continued. But when I started showing with this baby, she touched her stomach gently. People began asking questions. Lily's father was Chinese, you see, and this baby's father was a buffalo soldier, a black cavalryman who got hurt bad and came to the mission for healing. Now Ezra understood. Even in 1867, plenty of folks couldn't accept families that looked different from what they thought was normal. Margaret and her children represented everything that scared small-minded people. Mixing of races, women making their own choices, love that didn't follow society's rules. The mission board decided I was setting a bad example. Margaret went on, her voice getting harder. They said I could stay if I gave up the baby for adoption to a proper Christian family. When I refused, they threw you out, Ezra finished. Worse, they accused me of stealing from the donation box, said I took money meant for orphans and spent it on myself. Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. I did take $30, but it was for medicine when Lily got sick with fever last winter. I was going to pay it back as soon as I could, but they didn't give you the chance. No, they got the territorial judge involved, a man named Harrison who owed the mission board favors. He issued a warrant for my arrest and said they'd take Lily away from me if I got caught. Margaret's voice broke a little. So we ran. Been running for 2 months now, trying to get to my sister in California. Ezra felt that old familiar anger building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him away from civilization in the first place. People with power using it to crush those who couldn't fight back. It was the same story, whether it happened on a battlefield, or in a church, or in a small mountain cabin. You're safe here, he said simply. Margaret looked at him with surprise. You don't even know us. Why would you risk helping strangers? Ezra was quiet for a long moment, watching Lily sleep peacefully by the fire. The little girl had spent the morning helping him repair a broken trap, her small fingers surprisingly skilled at working with leather and wire. She sang while she worked, old songs he remembered from his own childhood, before the world got complicated and mean. Maybe because you're not really strangers, he said finally. Maybe because running away from people who want to hurt you is something I understand pretty well. That evening, as the storm finally started to calm down, Lily helped him prepare dinner. She chattered away about everything and nothing while she stirred the pot of beans, completely comfortable with him in a way that surprised them both. Mr. Ezra, she said suddenly, do you think God gets mad when people are different colors? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? Well, Mama says God made all kinds of people, like flowers in a garden. But the folks in Cheyenne acted like God made a mistake with us. Lily's young face was serious as she thought about complicated things. I don't understand why being different makes people so angry. Ezra knelt down so he was at her eye level. You know what I think, Lily? I think people get scared when they see something they don't understand. And when people are scared, sometimes they do mean things instead of just asking questions or learning something new. Like how bears get angry when they're scared. Exactly like that. But just because some people act mean doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you or your mama. You're both perfect, just the way you are. Lily smiled at him, the first real smile he'd seen since they'd arrived, and something shifted in Ezra's chest. For the first time in 10 years, his cabin felt less like a hiding place and more like a home. But as the wind died down and the snow stopped falling, Ezra knew their peaceful time was running out. Soon the mountain passes would be clear again, and people would be able to travel. That meant Margaret and Lily would have to keep running toward California, and he'd be alone again. It also meant that anyone chasing them would be able to reach his cabin. As if she could read his thoughts, Margaret spoke quietly from her chair. They'll come looking for us once the storm clears. That Judge Harrison doesn't like being told no, and the mission board has connections all over the territory. Ezra looked out his small window at the clearing skies and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the desire to fight for something instead of just running away from it. The question was, would he have the courage to stand his ground when the time came? The sound of Margaret's screaming pierced through the cabin walls like a knife cutting silk. Ezra's hands shook as he dropped his morning coffee, the hot liquid splashing across his boots. Something was terribly wrong. He burst through the door to find Lily kneeling beside her mother's bed, tears streaming down her small face. Margaret lay twisted in pain, her skin pale as winter frost, one hand pressed against her swollen belly. "The baby's coming too early," Margaret gasped, between waves of agony. Something's not right. Ezra had seen men die on battlefields, had watched friends take their last breaths in his arms. But this was different. This was life trying to enter the world, and it was fighting against everything nature intended. His war experience meant nothing here. "What do I do?" he asked, surprised by how small his voice sounded. "Boil water," Margaret whispered. "Clean cloths, and pray." The next 6 hours felt like 6 years. Ezra moved between the fireplace and bedside like a man possessed, heating water, changing bloody sheets, holding Margaret's hand when the pain became too much to bear alone. Lily helped where she could, bringing cool water for her mother's fevered brow, singing soft songs she remembered from better days. "Tell me about your family," Margaret said during a brief moment of relief, trying to distract herself from the pain building again. "Had a brother once," Ezra said, wringing out another cloth. "Lost him at Shiloh. Parents died of fever when I was 16. Been alone ever since." "Not anymore," Lily said quietly from her corner. "You got us now." The simple words hit Ezra harder than any bullet ever had. For 10 years, he'd convinced himself that being alone was safer, easier. But looking at this brave little girl caring for her suffering mother, he realized he'd been lying to himself. He'd been hiding, not living. Another scream tore through the air, and Margaret's grip on his hand tightened like a steel trap. "It's coming," she whispered. "The baby's coming now." Ezra had delivered foals and calves, had even helped a fellow soldier's wife birth twins during the war. But his hands trembled as he positioned himself at the foot of the bed. This wasn't just any baby. This was their baby now, part of the family he'd never expected to have. "I can see the head," he announced, wonder filling his voice despite the circumstances. What happened next unfolded like a miracle wrapped in terror. The baby emerged blue and still, not breathing, tiny and fragile as a bird fallen from its nest. Ezra's heart stopped. "Why isn't he crying?" Lily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Without thinking, Ezra cleared the infant's mouth with his finger, then breathed gently into the tiny lungs. Once, twice, on the third breath, the baby's chest rose on its own, and a weak but angry wail filled the cabin. "He's alive!" Margaret sobbed, reaching for her son with shaking arms. As Ezra placed the baby against his mother's chest, he felt something inside his own chest crack open. Not break, but open, like ice melting after a long winter, making room for something he'd forgotten how to feel. Hope. But their relief lasted only moments. Margaret's bleeding hadn't stopped. If anything, it was getting worse. "Ezra," she whispered, her voice growing weaker, "if something happens to me, I promise you'll take care of them. Both of them." "Nothing's going to happen," he said firmly, but fear crept into his voice. He'd seen this before on the battlefield. Too much blood, lost too quickly. "Promise me," Margaret insisted, her eyes locking onto his. "I promise," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Through sheer determination and what Ezra would later call divine intervention, Margaret's bleeding finally slowed. The crisis passed like a violent storm, leaving behind exhaustion and profound gratitude. As she drifted into healing sleep, the baby nestled against her chest, Ezra found himself staring at this tiny family he'd somehow become part of. "What should we name him?" Lily asked, gently touching her baby brother's tiny fist. Ezra looked out the window at the first green shoots pushing through the last patches of snow. After months of death-cold winter, life was returning to the mountains. Life was returning to his cabin. Life was returning to his heart. "Hope," he said softly. "We'll call him Hope." But even as joy filled the small cabin, Ezra couldn't shake a growing worry. 3 people now depended on him, and he'd spent 10 years learning how to depend on no one. What if he wasn't strong enough? What if his damaged heart couldn't love them the way they deserved? What if the past he'd been running from finally caught up with all of them? The baby's cries at midnight had become as regular as sunrise. But Ezra found he didn't mind losing sleep. He'd discovered something surprising about himself. He was good at this. Good at warming bottles by lamplight. Good at rocking Hope back to sleep. Good at being needed. "You don't have to get up every time," Margaret said one morning, watching him return from another middle-of-the-night feeding session. "I can manage." "I want to," Ezra replied, and realized he meant it completely. The spring weeks passed, like pages in a book he never wanted to finish reading. Lily learned to help with Hope's baths, her serious 8-year-old face focused intently on keeping the tiny boy safe and warm. Margaret grew stronger each day, her laughter returning like birdsong after winter silence. The cabin, which had been Ezra's hideaway from the world, transformed into something he'd never experienced before. A real home. "Teach me to hunt," Lily announced one morning, appearing beside Ezra as he prepared to check his traps. "Young ladies don't hunt," he said automatically, then caught himself. Who was he to decide what young ladies could or couldn't do? "This young lady does," Lily said, with a determination that reminded him of her mother. "If I'm going to live on a mountain, I need to know mountain things." So Ezra taught her how to read animal tracks in the mud, how to move silently through the forest, how to identify which plants could heal and which could kill. Lily absorbed everything, like dry earth soaking up rain, asking questions that often surprised him with their cleverness. "Why did you come up here all by yourself?" she asked one afternoon as they sat by a stream, waiting for trout to take their bait. The question hung in the air like morning mist. Ezra had avoided thinking about his reasons for so long that examining them now felt like probing an old wound. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "when bad things happen, it feels safer to be alone." What bad things? Ezra studied this serious little girl who'd somehow wormed her way past all his defenses. "I was in the war, saw friends die, did things I'm not proud of. When I came back, I couldn't figure out how to live with other people anymore." Lily considered this with the gravity of someone much older. "Mama says bad things happen to everybody. The trick is not letting them make you forget about good things." Her simple wisdom hit him like revelation. For 10 years, he'd been so focused on his pain that he'd forgotten joy was even possible. These 2 females and 1 tiny boy had reminded him that life could be beautiful again. But that evening, as they shared dinner around the wooden table Ezra had built years ago for one person, Margaret grew quiet and thoughtful. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Winter's coming again," she said softly. "We'll need more supplies, more food, and Hope will need proper clothes, not just the blankets I've been wrapping him in." The truth they'd all been avoiding settled over the table like a heavy blanket. They would need to go to town eventually, and going to town meant facing questions, facing judgment, facing the world that had driven Margaret to seek refuge in these mountains. "People will talk," Margaret continued. "A Chinese woman living with a white mountain man. They'll say terrible things. Let them talk," Ezra said firmly. "It's not that simple," Margaret replied. "Lily needs schooling. Hope will need proper medical care sometimes. We can't hide up here forever." Lily looked between them with worried eyes. "Are we going to have to leave?" The question hit Ezra like a physical blow. Leave? The thought of this cabin returning to its former empty silence was unbearable. The thought of losing this family he'd never expected to love was worse than unbearable. It was impossible. "No," he said, his voice stronger than he'd heard it in years. "We're not leaving. We're staying right here. All of us. Together." "But the townfolk," Margaret began. "The townfolk can go to hell," Ezra interrupted, then quickly looked at Lily. "Sorry for the language. I've heard worse," Lily said matter-of-factly, which made both adults smile, despite the serious conversation. "I mean it," Ezra continued. "This is our home now. our family, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take that away from us." But even as he spoke the brave words, doubt gnawed at his heart. Could a broken soldier, a mixed-race woman, and 2 children really build a life together in a world that seemed determined to tear apart anything different or unconventional? Was his love for them enough to protect them from the harsh realities waiting beyond their mountain sanctuary? As if sensing his inner turmoil, Baby Hope chose that moment to wake from his nap, his healthy cries filling the cabin with the sound of pure, demanding life. Margaret rose to tend to him, and Lily began clearing the dinner dishes, and Ezra sat watching his family with a mixture of fierce protectiveness and growing dread. Tomorrow, he would need to make decisions that could change everything. But tonight, he would hold on to this moment of perfect, fragile happiness for as long as the darkness would let him. The crack of breaking ice echoed through the valley like a gunshot. But it wasn't nature making that sound. It was the hoofbeats of 3 horses charging up the mountain trail. Ezra dropped his axe and grabbed his spyglass, his stomach turning cold as he spotted the glint of metal badges catching the morning sun. "Margaret!" he called, bursting through the cabin door. She was nursing Baby Hope by the window, humming softly, while Lily played with carved wooden animals on the floor. The peaceful scene shattered like glass when she saw his face. "They found us," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Through the window, they watched the riders grow larger. 2 men wore the silver stars of territorial deputies, their horses lathered with sweat from a hard ride. The 3rd man sat straight in his saddle like a preacher delivering judgment. His black coat flapped behind him like raven wings, and even from a distance, his pale face looked mean as winter. "Who is he?" Ezra asked, checking his rifle. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled a shawl around Hope. "Judge Harrison. He runs the territorial court in Cheyenne. He's the one who—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Lily looked up from her toys, her dark eyes wide with fear. "Are the bad men coming to take us away?" Before anyone could answer, a voice boomed across the clearing like thunder. "Ezra McKinnon! Come out where we can see you!" Ezra peered through the crack in the door. The 3 men had stopped 50 yards away, close enough to talk, but far enough to draw guns if needed. The judge sat in the middle, his thin face twisted in a cruel smile. The deputies flanked him like hunting dogs, waiting for orders. "What do you want?" Ezra called back, stepping onto his porch but keeping his rifle ready. Judge Harrison's voice carried the fake sweetness of poisoned honey. "We're here on official territorial business. You're harboring a criminal and stolen children. These children aren't stolen. They're with their mother." "Their mother is a thief," Harrison spat. "Margaret Chen robbed the mission fund in Cheyenne. $30 silver meant for God's work." Behind Ezra, Margaret stepped onto the porch, her chin raised high despite her trembling hands. "I took medicine money from my dying boy. Nothing more. Theft is theft, woman. Your kind always has excuses." The way he said "your kind" made Ezra's blood boil. He'd heard that tone before, in army camps and frontier towns. It was the voice of men who thought some people mattered less than others. "The children need proper Christian homes," Harrison continued, "away from criminal influence. The territorial law gives me authority to place them with suitable families." "Suitable white families, you mean?" Margaret said quietly. Harrison's smile grew wider and meaner. "The law is the law, Mrs. Chen. These mountains won't protect you forever." Ezra felt something dangerous stirring in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had before battle, when right and wrong became clear as mountain air. "How much?" "What did you say?" "The $30. How much with interest?" Harrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "This isn't about money anymore, McKinnon. It's about proper upbringing. These half-breed children need civilized guidance." The word hit Ezra like a physical blow. He'd heard men use it before, always with hatred dripping from their voices, always about people whose only crime was loving across the lines that others drew. "You can't take them," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "I can and I will. The territorial court has given me full authority. Stand aside, or face the consequences." One of the deputies, a young man with nervous eyes, shifted in his saddle. "Judge, maybe we should just collect the debt, and—" "Quiet," Harrison snapped. "I make the decisions here." Ezra noticed something important in that moment. The deputy looked uncomfortable, like maybe he didn't fully agree with what they were doing. The other deputy, older with scars on his face, kept checking the tree line, like he expected trouble. "You have 1 minute to bring out the woman and children," Harrison announced, pulling out a pocket watch. "Then my deputies will collect them by force." Inside the cabin, Hope started crying as if he could sense the danger. Lily pressed against her mother's legs, and Margaret's face went pale as fresh snow. "There has to be another way," she whispered to Ezra. "There is," he replied, but his words carried the weight of a man preparing for war. The seconds ticked by like heartbeats. Harrison snapped his watch closed and nodded to his deputies. "Time's up, McKinnon. Step aside." That's when Ezra made a choice that would change everything. "No." The single word rang across the clearing like a church bell, clear and final. Judge Harrison's face turned red as sunset. "You're interfering with territorial justice, McKinnon. That's a hanging offense." "Then I guess we have a problem," Ezra replied, raising his rifle to his shoulder with practiced ease. The two deputies reached for their guns, but something in Ezra's stillness made them pause. This wasn't the desperate move of a cornered animal. This was the calm certainty of a man who had found something worth dying for. "You can't shoot us all," the scarred deputy said, but his voice cracked like thin ice. "Maybe not," Ezra agreed, "but I can promise you won't all ride home tonight. Question is, which two of you want to explain to your families why you died trying to steal children from their mother?" The nervous young deputy's hand moved away from his gun. "Judge, maybe we should think about this." "Coward," Harrison snarled. "I'm a territorial judge. This man can't threaten me." "Seems like he just did," the scarred deputy muttered. Behind Ezra, Margaret stepped forward with quiet dignity. Baby Hope had stopped crying, as if even he understood the importance of this moment. Lily clutched her mother's skirt but stood brave as a mountain pine. "Judge Harrison," Margaret said, her voice steady as stone, "you want to punish me for saving my child's life. What kind of justice is that?" "The kind that keeps society proper and ordered," Harrison replied, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold air. "Proper?" Ezra laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Like the proper order that let children starve while mission money sat in locked boxes? Like the proper society that drives families into the wilderness for the crime of loving each other?" The young deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, if the woman was just trying to save her child—" "Enough!" Harrison's voice cracked like a whip. "I won't be questioned by half-breeds and mountain trash." That word trash hung in the air like smoke from a forest fire. Ezra had been called worse things by better men, but something about hearing it in front of his new family lit a fire in his chest. "You know what I think, Judge?" Ezra said, stepping down from the porch. "I think you're not here about $30 or proper upbringing. I think you're here because it burns you up that these good people found happiness without asking your permission. How dare you? I think you're so full of hate that you'd rather destroy a family than admit you might be wrong." The scarred deputy cleared his throat. "Judge, the territorial governor has been asking questions about your methods. Maybe we should report back that the debt has been satisfied?" Harrison whipped around to glare at his own man. "Are you questioning my authority?" "No, sir. Just suggesting we might want to avoid complications." For a moment, nobody moved. The wind whistled through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out like a warning. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then Lily did something that changed everything. She walked past her mother, past Ezra, and stopped halfway between the cabin and the horses. This tiny 8-year-old girl, no taller than a man's waist, looked up at 3 armed adults and spoke with a voice clear as mountain water. "My mama never stole nothing wrong," she said. "She just loved me enough to keep me alive. Why is that bad?" The young deputy's face crumpled like paper. Even the scarred one looked away. Judge Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Child, you don't understand," Harrison began. "I understand that you want to take me away from my family," Lily interrupted. "I understand that makes you a bad man." The silence that followed was deeper than winter snow. In that quiet moment, everyone could see the truth as clear as daylight. A little girl had just shown 3 grown men what real justice looked like. Finally, the young deputy spoke. "Judge, I got a daughter about her age at home. I can't. I won't do this." "Nor will I," added the scarred deputy. "This feels wrong, sir. Real wrong." Judge Harrison looked around wildly, his authority crumbling like a riverbank in spring flood. "You're all making a terrible mistake," he said, but his voice had lost its power. Ezra lowered his rifle slightly. The only mistake here would be tearing apart a family that never hurt anybody. For several long heartbeats, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then Judge Harrison jerked his reins around with angry violence. "This isn't finished, McKinnon," he snarled. "I'll be back with federal marshals. With soldiers if necessary. You can't hide in these mountains forever." "Maybe not," Ezra replied. "But I can try." As the 3 men rode away, their horses' hooves echoing off the canyon walls like thunder, one question hung in the mountain air like morning mist. What would Ezra do when they returned with more men and bigger guns? The crack of a rifle split the morning air like thunder. Ezra's warning shot sent snow cascading from the pine branches above the 3 men's heads. Judge Harrison's horse reared, nearly throwing him from the saddle. "Next one finds flesh," Ezra called out, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man who had killed before and would again if pushed. Deputy Marshal Williams, the younger of the 2 lawmen, shifted nervously in his saddle. His partner, a grizzled veteran named Colt, kept his hand steady near his pistol, but made no sudden moves. Both men had heard stories about mountain hermits who'd lost their minds to isolation. But this wasn't madness they faced, it was cold, calculating determination. "You're making a mistake, McKinnon," Judge Harrison shouted, his face red with rage and embarrassment. "I represent the territorial government. You can't threaten an officer of the court." "Ain't threatening nobody," Ezra replied, never lowering his rifle. "Just protecting my family from men who ride onto my land making accusations without proof." Behind him, Margaret appeared in the cabin doorway, baby Hope cradled in her arms. Lily peeked out from behind her mother's skirts, her dark eyes wide but unafraid. The sight of them, his family, sent steel through Ezra's spine. Deputy Williams cleared his throat. "Sir, we just need to ask the lady some questions about the missing money from the Cheyenne mission." "She already answered," Ezra said. $30 for medicine. For a sick child. Any man with a heart would understand that. Judge Harrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "The law doesn't care about hearts, McKinnon. It cares about facts. And the fact is, she stole from a Christian institution." "The fact is," Margaret spoke for the first time, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I watched my 4-year-old son burn with fever while the mission doctor refused treatment because I couldn't pay. I took what I needed to save his life." "Where is this child now?" Deputy Colt asked, genuine curiosity in his weathered face. Margaret's silence stretched long and painful. When she finally spoke, her words fell like stones into still water. "He died anyway, 3 days after I got the medicine. The fever had already taken too much." The revelation hit the men like a physical blow. Even Judge Harrison seemed taken aback by this twist in the story they thought they knew. "That changes nothing," Harrison said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Changes everything," Ezra countered. "This woman lost a child because your so-called Christian mission cared more about money than mercy. She suffered enough." Deputy Williams dismounted slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss. Truly. But the law still requires—" His words died as Ezra's rifle swung toward him with lightning speed. Not aimed to kill, but close enough to remind everyone who held the advantage. The law, Ezra said quietly, hasn't been on her side yet. Why should she trust it now? The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Snow began falling again. Fat flakes that muffled sound and softened the harsh edges of the confrontation. In that frozen moment, each man faced a choice that would define who he truly was. Deputy Colt spoke first. Harrison, maybe we should reconsider. $30 against a mother's desperation doesn't seem like justice to me. Justice is blind to circumstances, the judge snapped. The law is the law. Then your law is broken, Ezra said simply. The wind picked up as darkness fell, howling through the canyon like the voices of the lost. Inside the cabin, the family huddled close to the fire, knowing this might be their last night of peace. Judge Harrison and his men had retreated to make camp a mile down the valley, but everyone understood this was just the calm before a larger storm. In the morning, the judge would ride back to Cheyenne and return with federal marshals, soldiers if necessary. The territorial government wouldn't tolerate armed resistance to its authority. They'll be back within a week, Margaret said quietly, rocking baby Hope as he fussed in her arms. With enough men to take us by force. Lily looked up from where she was helping Ezra clean his rifle. Are we gonna run away again, Mama? The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Running had defined Margaret's life for so long, fleeing prejudice in California, seeking refuge in Colorado, finally landing in Wyoming territory, only to face the same hatred in a different landscape. No more running, Ezra said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. This is our home now. But how can we stay? Margaret asked. They'll arrest you for threatening a judge. They'll take the children. Everything we've built here. Ezra set down the rifle and moved to his wooden chest in the corner. From beneath old newspapers and spare clothing, he pulled out a leather folder tied with string documents he'd never expected to need again. There's something I never told you about my time in the war, he said, untying the folder with steady hands. I wasn't just a soldier. I was a scout, sometimes a spy. Did things for the Union that required flexibility with the law. Margaret watched as he spread papers across the rough-hewn table. Official seals, signatures, documents that looked important even in the flickering firelight. After the war ended, certain people in Washington felt they owed me favors. Big favors. The kind that don't expire. He pointed to one particular document. This here's a territorial land grant. Makes this cabin and everything around it for 5 miles legally mine. No judge or marshal can force us off our own property. Hope had settled into peaceful sleep, but Margaret's eyes were wide with new possibility. And this one? Authorization to deputize citizens in defense of territorial property means I can legally arm neighbors, make them lawmen if needed. Ezra's smile was grim but determined. Judge Harrison thinks he's dealing with a crazy hermit. He's about to learn he picked a fight with someone who knows how the system really works. Lily clapped her hands together quietly, understanding enough to know this meant they might actually win. There's more, Ezra continued, pulling out another paper. This is a marriage license, signed by the territorial governor himself, valid anywhere in Wyoming. We use this, and you become Margaret McKinnon. The children become legally mine. Harrison can't touch you for crimes committed by Margaret Chen. She'll cease to exist legally. Margaret stared at the document that could change everything. You'd really do that? Marry me just to protect us from the law? Ezra looked at this woman who had brought light back into his dark world. At the little girl who called him Papa without reservation. At the baby boy who represented hope itself, sleeping peacefully in his mother's arm. The answer came from somewhere deeper than strategy or legal maneuvering. I'd marry you because I love you, he said simply. All of you. The legal protection is just a benefit. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin, warmth spread through hearts that had forgotten what safety felt like. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, They were a family preparing to fight for their right to stay that way. As Margaret reached across the table to take Ezra's scarred hand in hers, baby Hope stirred and smiled in his sleep, as if he could sense that his world had just become infinitely more secure.